over effect of previous administrations. So in the case of the early days of the Weinberg administration, you would have carryovers from the Harold Brown Democratic administration. And then you had 12 years worth of Republicans, and then the current Dakowitz has got carryover from there. So it's sort of a
bigger and bigger?
Yeah, I mean, everybody could come to the meetings, and many of them did, because it was a forum for speaking out on women's affairs of the various military by whomever wanted to use that particular forum to speak out. So Chuck Hines and his boys, and we had females on that commission as well as names, task force. First of all, went to the Department of Labor work classification codes. I went to the Department of Labor work classification codes because those classification codes had stood up under scrutiny by court challenge, and therefore were an effective way to say that we had our description of jobs related to an existing code that had been prescribed by folks who had nothing to do with the Army, and yet they had stood up to court challenge in workmen's compensation cases and other kind of cases. And we then pulsed TRADOC and had TRADOC to do a subjective evaluation, should say subjective quasi-objective evaluation of the tasks that people had to do by MOSs in order to be able to in some way grade out the strength requirements to either push, pull, lift, or lift with others in a particular MOS. Let me give you an example. It's fairly clear, and you can make an objective assessment according to these classification codes, that the work in an artillery crew was very heavy work, because you had to lift a projectile that weighed 96 pounds from the ground to an elevation at chest height. And therefore, if 2, 3, or 4 people, 1, 2, 3, or 4 people were required to do that, this fit into the criteria that the labor code had developed that described that as very heavy work. So we ended up with very heavy work, average work, or moderate heavy work, light work, and sedentary work. Now, if you go through all the tasks associated with being a soldier, where even the secretary, let's say secretarial help on a clerk typist MOS, may have to pull guard duty, may have to throw hand grenades, may have to retrieve wounded, etc. Why then we begin to be able to flesh out various and sundry MOSs fell in various and sundry of these classification codes. And from that, we then ascertained with some testing how many people would be able to do various kinds of work. We then at ARI do a study and find out with incoming recruits how many recruits passing through, let's say 400 people going through Fort Jackson, or 1,000 Fort Jackson women going through there. We devised a test on determining if you could do X upon entry, then with 12 weeks or 14 weeks or 18 weeks of basic and advanced individual training, how you would be able to build strength during that training modality, so that by the time you exited the MOS course for which you enlisted, you would be able to handle the requisites of that, whether it's lifting artillery projos or lifting pencils or throwing grenades or whatever it was going to do. So we could give you a predictive test on a small machine, much like one of these lap machines that you may find that is an exercise machine, for lifting, pushing, and pulling. And for a while, we put those in recruiting station and actually used them for measuring potential. The recruiters later, after I left the enterprise, got rid of them, which is a mistake. But at any rate, went through all this drill and finally came up with a policy statement that mirrored the two laws around the course, which would exclude women from direct combat, which essentially said women will be excluded from infantry, armor, artillery, and others that would bring you into routine direct combat with the enemy. And then we came up with some statements about transiting the combat area. And we came up with a thing called the DCPC, the Direct Combat Probability Code. And we came up with 7 such codes that ranged anywhere from the front lines to the front lines to the forward edge of the battle, or to the CONUS, and there became 7 of these direct combat probability codes, with number 1 being direct combat. And the view was, if you have to close with, the salient feature of this is that your duties required you to close with the enemy on a routine, underlying routine basis, which became the DPCP code. And then we had rules associated with rules of association. So it said that while you may be an while you may not be an infantryman, because you have a routine job closing with it and defeating the enemy, that you might also be an ordnance person or a clerk typist. And could you be a company clerk, or could you be a member of a contact team with an infantry or armor unit? And we said that the rules of association were also applicable, and therefore if you were female and you were a medic, you could not be assigned to a battalion aid station. If you were a female and you were a clerk typist, you couldn't be a PLO clerk down in some company or battalion. And we brought all these papers up to Secretary Jack Marsh, and after excruciating review by his MNRA and by his Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower Reserve Affairs, by himself, and by briefing Weinberger and Weinberger's staff, we then issued this policy. We briefed the Dakowitz in training, got some feedback from them, most of which was hostile, because they preferred, even in the Republican administration, to open up essentially all the boats, although they never said open up infantry and armament. So that now becomes the policy, and that has substantial effect now on how you code these, how you code the units, how you code the billets, how you code each individual person's record. So he or she knows what kind of unit they can serve in and can't serve in and the like, and becomes a substantial administrative burden to administer. It also has anomalies in that normally you would not necessarily place some military intelligence units right on the front lines in a normal hostile conflagration, but because Europe was on the defensive, you put some intelligence units right square on the interzonal boundary between East Germany and West Germany, or in Korea. And so you had women operating in front of the infantry. So you had anomalies of these various kinds. We also took a stab at, based upon these codes of heavy, very heavy, and all that kind of stuff, when we looked at the number of stretcher bearers in a particular unit, we tried to make sure that women had, that you didn't exceed X number of women in a particular unit if you had to handle casualties, for example. Now that policy rocked along without much change to it from about 1982 to 1987, about 5 years. Meanwhile, the Dachowitz were always constantly nibbling on this regulatory matter that we had issued. And finally, they persuaded Secretary Weinberger to reopen the issue of the direct combat casualty care, direct combat probability codes. And they assigned the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, a guy named David Armour, A-R-M-O-R, to review all these policies. Dave Armour did so, and in 1988 he took a new policy to then Secretary of Defense Carlucci, and there was some modification of the assignment game, and but essentially he stuck with the rules about the direct combat probability code, and he stuck with our concept of exclusion from front lines of the battlefield.
Did he have input from the then DESPER?
Yeah.
Then?
By that time, Al Lono was the DESPER, I believe. There had been some modifications of what jobs were open on a. What we said was we made an initial evaluation of what jobs would be open in 1981, 82, or which ones would be closed, and then as new evidence came forth or new information pertained, that jobs would be open or shut. Let me give you an example. The Pershing II missile system came on board in that period of time. And we said because the Pershing II missile system, although you would be subjected to retribution by the opposing force, or Spetsnaz would be able to attack you, we did open the Pershing missile system because it was a new missile system, because it was, the setback was substantial from the front line area, that you would be permitted to, certain women would be permitted to serve in that unit because you were not routinely, underlined routinely, engaged in direct combat with forces. Although it's, you know, again, Spetsnaz could attack you. So at no time did we ever say that the battlefield was impervious to attack either by ground or by air or by missilery. But what we did insist on is that it was the routine engagement of people where the probability of killing was high and capture was high. So the Armour report came out in 1988 in the Reagan administration and essentially ratified the basic elements of the policy that we had invoked in 1982. Now, when Mr. Clinton, or when the Bush administration came in, there were still some minor openings that were going to go on about all that. And, but the Congress, well, right, some minor adjustments were made in the early days of the Bush administration. Then the next major event in this saga unfolds in the call-up of various and sundry people who are going to get ready to go to war in the Persian Gulf. There have been some minor hubbub established when it turns out I'm the commander at Panama and we have a female captain of military police who achieved some U.S. notoriety in terms of an attack on a small Panamanian objective, and there were cries in the Congress, and principally from Representative Schroeder, for the, you see here, here's combat, which we never denied would happen on any battlefield. And oh, by the way, the MPs are embroiled in it, and an MP female is embroiled in it. And there were MP helicopter drivers in lift ships, Blackhawks, during the attack. None of which we ever denied that there would be women in combat. There would be women in combat, but they would not be in the business of routinely engaging for the purposes of prosecuting a war where high injury rates or high death rates or capture rates would ensue. So, as an aftermath of the Panama affair, and as the reserves began to get called up, doctors began to get shipped overseas for the Persian Gulf, and women began to see, and you had these public visions of women saying goodbye to their lap babies and getting in their combat gear and being posted overseas. There became another major effort in the Congress to take stock of women in the military. And only by the skin of our teeth in the Persian Gulf frigates did we escape having a ruling made that women who had children, young children, would be excluded from going to combat, which would be the worst possible thing you could have in the Army.
Yes.
Says you can serve as a soldier, but you can't go to war. Man, that's crazy stuff. So, at the conclusion of the Persian Gulf fracas, because we had, nominally 50,000 women serving in the Persian Gulf, and we had the positive side of things going very well with women serving in the Gulf, and the negative side of hanky-panky on the recreation ship that was sent over there on the one hand, women getting pregnant on Navy ships that were in the Gulf region, and the business of women leaving little kids back here in America as they went off to war with the thought of being orphaned. The administration, in order to avoid hearings and the like, agreed to conduct a presidential commission on women in the armed forces. The assignment of women in the armed forces.
Guess who got to be a commissioner?
And I got a call, I was in retirement at the time, and I got a call, and the lady said, "We'd like you to be on this panel." And I said, Secretary Cheney would like me to be on this panel. And I said, well, I take a tremendous amount of baggage, because I'm the guy that invented the current Army policy as the desk of the Army 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And then she answered the telltale question that I answer, of course, which is the one, she said, "Are you fair?" And obviously unfair. And she said, if you're fair, then we want you to serve on the committee. Well, I look at one of those things as being a public service. After all, the government is paying my retired pay, and I owe them some. So I agreed to serve on that, and then the Harris Commission was born, and I then served as one of the commissioners on Women in the Army panel. You are done. Now a bag of saline. Bag it. Captain Waterman brought me a tin of funky Band-Aids, since I go through a lot of Band-Aids every day. So I now have deep neon Band-Aids on my abdomen. It's a long story on the commission, okay? Now, there's a whole nother story. I don't know whether you want to get into that, but papers are full of that. Whether or not you want to get into that, we can do it. But that's sort of the saga of women in the army. Women in the army. So some names that you want to go false are clearly Chuck Hines, formative guy in that. Bob Elton knows a lot about it, and Tony Durso was one of the guys who was an analyst on that. He retired as a colonel not too long ago. Chuck Hines went on to become a major general in the Army as the commander of Fort McClellan, Alabama. And he's now here, works for the Smithsonian. He's a director of security, having been an MP at the Smithsonian. So he's a very responsible guy and invented a terrific system. And the latest, Les Aspin just published a document before he stepped down, I think it was dated in December, on the revision of the system and all. And although one of the things we had come to grips with was the risk rule, which is another way to talk about the direct combat probability code, while he abolished the risk rule, he did retain the essence of what we had described as infantry, armor, field artillery as being off limits for women in ground units, and did have a risk rule associated with being assigned to a unit, so that women cannot be assigned below brigade level in those kinds of units, infantry, armor, field. Women are now permitted by the changing the law to serve in combatant aircraft, non-combatant ships.
Right. But they could be in a headquarters battery of our field artillery brigade, but not.
That's right. But not in, yeah.
Excuse me, hello, sir. You doing all right?
Yeah,
Okay.
doing fine.
Okay.
And the flights are in, I don't have any,
They'll probably keep this just hooked up for about 20 minutes or so, if you don't mind.
no, it's fine.
Okay,
I'm doing fine. I don't have any blowdown.
Good, sir. Take care now.
Okay, Frank?
See you tomorrow.
Right.
Set of vitals.
Okay. Never wait till this one's done. So when we had the commission, among other things, we voted to open ships except submarines, and we voted to open keep closed the ground and keep the aircraft closed. The ground was almost universal on closing. Opening ships was 8-7, and I was a swing vote on that, to open them. And then I was the swing vote on closing aircraft. And my reason for closing aircraft and opening ships goes like this. Ships in the main, except for submarines, do not traverse the enemy's soil or homeland, and therefore have very low prospect of being captured. And they don't routinely engage the enemy where there is a high prospect of capture or casualty. You can have casualties in the Navy, obviously, as witness World War II. With respect to Air Force, the Air Force doctrine is to take the fight to the enemy's homeland.
So they fly over
They fly
routinely.
over, and so they're routinely engaged in a place where, if you're in combat aircraft, where the prospect of being shot down and the prospect of being captured
Very
is
high.
high. I guess my reason for excluding women, for voting to exclude women from aircraft, was the indelible impression of Lieutenant Zahn, who was the Navy aviator who was captured in Baghdad, and they beat the hell out of him and then put him on television. And I couldn't feature that being done to an American woman. And my own view is it's not a question of are we so short of males that you need females in order to retain a high quality pilot force? The answer is there are plenty of high quality males for high quality aviation force, and therefore you don't need to open the market for that particular work. In other words, no good reason for subjecting women to that kind of stuff. Now, that's my view, and a lot of other people have different views about it. And so later on, Aspen makes a decision to not do what the commission says and do what the Democrats were going to do anyway. Now, break. In the course of the assignment of women in the armed forces, we found out some startling information. For example, there were almost 10,000 children under the age of 10 years old who were left in the United States as their parents went off to war. So if you'd had a substantial casualty problem in the Middle East,
Lots of
Scuds
orphans.
had really done, you would have had a lot of orphans. And the American people don't have any sense about that because we didn't have the casualties. So the next guy is going to have a problem. He has 10,000, 20,000 casualties, and the national policy has been, we'll walk off and leave little kids back here. When essentially you don't need to. I mean, there's plenty of population out there. You don't really need to cause women to get in that kind of fracas. But if women are going to serve, then they got to go off and do combatant duties. But we identified 17 issues in the commission. And there is a commission report, and I can give you a copy of it. Those issues are still around. I mean, so the big three issues were, do women serve in the Army, Navy, or Air Force? But there's another whole subset of issues which have to do with, can women do the work? How about little kids, etc. So pregnancy rules and all that, which vary by service and the like. So
They're still hanging out there unresolved.
they're out there waiting for attention. But we identified those in our panel.
You weren't involved in the close call about whether there'd be a ruling for Desert Storm that women with young kids
No.
couldn't go, were you?
I was flat on my back in.
Yeah.
in Johns Hopkins during all that, trying to recover from leukemia. But that did go on, and there was about to be a congressional issue about it. My general view is that the capture game is one of the most important considerations. If you look at the Army major who was captured, she came before our commission and she reported that she had been sexually assaulted. As had the Spec Corps who had been captured. I don't think that put women through that. That may be a Victorian age notion about that, but it sort of has to do with
It's a special vulnerability that
no other army in the world has women as combat arms. And so we got a great big population, we don't need people in there. The Russians had them during World War II in extremis, because the country was getting ready to be lost. The Israelis, contrary to popular belief, never had them in there.
never happened.
So there's a lot, I think we sorted through a tremendous amount of notions and got down some meaningful work, and the 17 recommendations, I think, were all good ones. Several have been acted on, most have not.
There was a subject that I wanted to renew with you, and
Okay.
that's this business of infusion.
Mm-hmm.
It was apparent to a lot of people in Vietnam that having an event at which, when most of the people in a unit went home, was something that was a catastrophe to be avoided. And apparently Colonel Norris, for one, felt that acutely when he lost his S1, 2, 3, and 4 in the same month. One of the pieces of fallout of that, I guess, is you're having to take over the job that normally the 4 would have done about getting the parts to the units that had a lot of weapons down. So essentially, here was a destructive personnel policy implemented to solve, in the name of solving an immediate problem, which was perceived as being a disaster, of having units go to almost total 100% turnover in a month or something. Then there was the history of resistance to cohort by the usurer people and the armor community and the personnel management people. Again, to solve what were the problems that were on their desk at the moment, such as the people being unhappy when a cohort company came and joined the battalion and so forth, and everybody else felt like they were second class. Now what I'm trying to get your view on is this preoccupation with immediate problems destroying the ability to take a long view and get a long-term solution. Now you were able to get away with taking a lot of risks and taking a long-term solution, for example, in the recruiting situation. And also in general, with the functional area analysis business, these were not quick fixes, these were long-term looks. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how ingrained in the Army preoccupation with what's happening right now, what's going to happen in the next, for example, readiness reporting cycle, how much that drives ability to make policy, command, and so on.
I think that in the main, the Army, over time, has gotten itself into a short-range view problem. And let me cite you some cases about that. The business of fairness and equality fairness in general is a virtue that the Army likes to ascribe to itself. While never having been in the infantry, my understanding of the way infantry operations may take place is not on every day does the point man remain the same. In the infantry's advancement game. On occasion, the point man may be relieved, one, because of tiredness, or two, because suspicions go down, but in some cases because people feel the risk is such that the risk ought to be ameliorated among individuals. I believe World War II was the last time in which we felt, as a corporate body, that equality went out the window if it imperiled efficiency. And therefore, we had units that landed on D-Day that fought straight through to the conclusion of VE Day. And people who lived moved up into ever-increasing job responsibilities in the main, while constantly being replenished with new people who came in from the United States and therefore were absorbed in the unit. I mean, take General Depew, for example, fought with the same unit all the way across Europe. He didn't hit Europe on D-Day, but he was pretty close behind that. General Stilwell was in that same unit. He was variously a regimental S3, the division G3, etc. So he stayed in the same unit for the whole time, and a battalion commander. So a number of people joined units in World War II. And if they lived, they stayed in those units through the end of the war. In other words, the enlistment contract looked like that, or the draft contract looked like that.
Duration.
Because it said duration +6. Now, as I understand it, at the conclusion of World War II, there came upon the U.S. Army, how do we discharge people here? And so people then, in what is now ARI, came up with a formula solution to saying, well, people who had the highest risk during combat would get the highest premium towards being discharged and came home. And so they adopted that on the heels of a riot in France. Because people said the war is over, it's time to go home. So as soon as they put out a rule base, people could then count up their points and they could figure out when they were going to go home. So everybody became very happy because we have an equitable way to measure things, and therefore I know what my number of points is, and I can figure out when I'm going home, and so I resolve myself to exist in the dimensionality where I'm going to exist until I achieve whatever point score, or they call my number of points up and bring it home. Now, if you look at the fighting in Korea, I believe that in Korea we began to be plagued by, we're going to spread this thing around, and it won't be the duration +6. It will be, we'll come over here and fight. And we began to get the 13-month tour game going, and people then said, well, gee whiz, if I got 13 months ago, and we stay on an individual replacement system, then I'll be rotating people through on basic training. Some of the regulars will go back for second or third tours. But in the main, everybody's going to get one tour before we begin to rotate through the second tour unless you volunteer to go to it. So we began to carry this equality game, which had come out of World War II, into assignment policy in a fighting game. And I believe that was the beginning of our undoing. And so we became accustomed then with a group of people who fought, let's say Scheimeyer and people who graduated in the class of 1950 and 51. They fought in that battle, people in the class of 46, 47, 48. They fought in those battles and they began to think that this is the way you fight. How about just getting that to see who it is and tell them I'm calling back.
General Thurman's room. Meade of the North Country.
I'm calling back.
He asked me to tell you he'd call you back. Does he have your number?
Why don't you jot that down?
He'll be tied up for a while. It'd probably be well if I got your number. Let me get a piece of paper.
Just tell them I'm getting a transfusion here and that'll do it.
He's getting a transfusion. That takes a while. Okay, can I have your number, sir? Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Okay, are there any times when you won't be there? Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, I'll give him the message. Yes, sir. It's going to be hard to track down, and he'll call back in a couple of hours.
Okay, fine.
But I did get numbers for him, but he's going to be going out a lot.
So in the Korean game, we are in the business of starting up the 13-month tour. And I think that if you think your way through that for a moment, one can understand that it's done because of raising forces efficiency and an equality statements. Let me talk to you about raising forces efficiency. Raising forces in quotes. If you go to a unit rotation policy in combat, then you have to raise, and you only want the unit to go over there and stay for 13 or 15 months or something, then you have to raise the cadre, put the people in it that's going to train it, and bring it up to a combat readiness standard, and then ship the unit intact to the theater, at which time you then trade out a unit that is in combat. Well, we didn't do that in World War II. We kept raising units, but we never traded any of them out. We were continually trying to raise the number of division forces in World War II. So our personnel people and our force development group have no experience base in the business of raising units and then rotating units out. So the hierarchy of the Army, the generals and the colonels and all that, don't have any experience with it. But they do have experience with the substitution of people in World War II. Even though those who lived stayed on, they then replenished those that died or were casualties. And therefore, it was a individual personnel system that got us through World War II. And when a unit came off the line, if it had been treated to 70% or 60% or something by casualty, brought off from the line, you infused it with another group of people from the replacement training depot in a unit, and they trained for a while and then went back in the line. So we didn't have an experiential base of shoving units in, so they fell back on the, quote, efficient way to continue to raise forces, which was keep the units you got over there, a la the World War II model, but instead of keeping the nucleus there, the surviving nucleus there forever, until the war was over, they also brought out the surviving nucleus. So whereas in World War II, the combat skills of the unit were enhanced the longer the unit survived in combat, because those who survived in combat were quote, survivors, unquote, on the one hand, and they were both the teachers and the trainers and the leaders for the next group of infusees to come in. But the bad part of both Korea and Vietnam was you took out the experienced leadership under the same kind of policy.